Thanks for tuning into World Building, Folklore, and Folk Magic, brought to you by Multiverse 2020, Right Track. Every human or human-like culture in every world has some sort of folklore and some sort of folk magic. So we're not talking ritualistic magic with robes and processions and you're a wizard, Harry, and spells, but the magic of the common people, herbs imbued with magical properties when picked under a full moon. The village witch who creates potions to snare you a man or make him go away. The elder who blesses the crops. So we're going to talk about how to create these rich folkloric traditions in our own worlds. My name is Rachel Brune. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be your moderator. And at this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to each give a quick introduction.
I'll dive in because that's what I do. I'm Paige L. Christie. I write feminist epic fantasy for the most part, and I tend to be in that earthy vein. It's not a lot of high magic and wizards and sorcerers. It's mostly ordinary people, mostly women, with lots of secrets. Yeah.
Ashley?
I'll pop up here. I am Ashley Chappell. I write high fantasy and urban fantasy. And with a lot of my high fantasy young adult series, I've done a lot of myth building and built the world around its own pantheon and folklore. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. I'm excited to talk about it with everybody.
Dee?
Hi, my name is Delia Norman. I do a little bit of dabbling writing fiction in fantasy and was slightly tinged with horror, but I do a lot more writing in non-fiction about magical practices. I'm a ceremonial magician, but I was raised in a folk magical tradition.
I'm Delia Remington, and I've written several things, but I have a vampire series that's called the Blood Royal Saga, and it's, important to me that I make, something that's such a well-trodden path of vampires into something that's different and unique, so people don't feel like they're hearing the same thing they've always heard. That's my thing. I did a lot of historical characters in mine, and I made my own little lore. So that's what I do.
Thanks. For more about our panelists, please check the linked videos from them in the description or on multiversecon.org, where you can also find links to all of our programming. So speaking of multiversecon.org, if you're watching this as part of the convention weekend stream, you can also join us on the Discord channel for this track for a watch party of this panel with some of the panelists. Instructions on how to get there are at multiversecon.org/Discord. We're also collecting for charity. You can donate at Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/multiversecon. And those donations, less fees, are all going to the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI.org. And last but not least, we have Multiverse swag. So check out the store on the website. We have shirts, enamel pins, and lots more. So without further ado, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the panel description, but when we talk about folklore and folk magic and worlds that use these as their magical underpinnings, what are we talking about? Do any of you have some good definitions, examples, things you'd like to throw out there to get us started?
I'll jump in there. For me, a lot of folklore is based on the relationships that the people have to the world around them, to nature, to other people, to the elements around them. For me, folklore is the way that they navigate those worlds and how they interpret them and what they actually mean to them.
And for me, I think a lot of folklore is about family and family tradition, and Dee can probably speak a little more to that as well. But it is the stories we pass on to ourselves and to others that define us. That's part of it as well.
I think one key element of it too is that a lot of times that this type of magic is largely unnamed. there's not a specific title or a specific name for the type of magic. It's the things that people do every day. It's woven into the fabric of their lives and is often closely related to information about how you run your household, in addition to, you know, how you do all this magical stuff. It also contains information about, you know, how you make sure your kids are safe and your laundry stays clean and all those other day-to-day things. So it gets interwoven in there.
For me, you know, with the vampire lore, there's all kinds of different rules and things like that. And for me, you know, it has to be the rules that the society and the it's not just the individual characters, but it's everything that happens in that entire story world, and it needs to fit as part of a whole. So, you know, with mine, I kind of play with those tropes because I have human characters who interact with the vampires, and they have these certain expectations based on things that they've seen in television and movies. And so they're, you know, I kind of play with that idea that they have expectations. Like one of the characters gets turned into a vampire and she's like, why am I not a ninja? What is happening? That's what happens in all the TV shows. I should be like able to, you know, kung fu anyone, and that's not how it's working. So, you know, that to me, you know, I like playing with that kind of expectation versus reality, and I think that's really important for characters to confront those in the story. I think that makes it more exciting for the readers because they come with expectations, and then they, you know, you have your own version of it.
So a couple of you guys had some great points that I want to tease out a little bit. We were talking about stories and talking about relationships, and a lot of the fiction that I've read that does have this basis on folklore and folk magic, it does seem to come from maybe a certain geographic area or maybe a certain time of history. And so I just want to maybe talk about different places that writers who say are going to get started building a world, where they can start reading or researching or looking for that history to start developing these worlds that do take advantage of stories and relationships and those sorts of things.
Well, you know, your library's great. Your grandparents are great if you're lucky enough to still have them around. Especially since, you know, if there are writers out there who come from immigrant families, you've got a wealth there of stuff that's not related to the Western world necessarily, maybe. And there are also some really good YouTube channels out there of all things. There's like a wonderful YouTube channel from a historian I think he's from Oxford in the UK, called Survive the Jive of all things. And he does everything from Egyptian mythology to Celtic mythology and on up into Norse mythology. And he doesn't just talk about it, he actually travels to the places and it's like, okay, we're in Dartmoor and this is the Wistwood and these are the stories that came out of it and here's why. So you can actually step beyond some of the traditional going and reading books and histories and things like that. In this new age, there's a visual media that can help you actually step into that place and see it, that a lot of people don't think to take advantage of. But YouTube and some of the videos out there, Gods and Monsters is a UK series, and there's a bunch of stuff that does history and folklore throughout the world out there. If you go hunting for it, it's not obvious, but there's some really cool stuff out there.
There's also some interesting academic journals that some of the older editions are now available online for free. And right now also academia.com, which is a kind of clearinghouse and has a lot of different academic papers on different types of folklore. It covers all types of academia. Right now they're running a special because of COVID-19 actually, and you can download and read up to 100 articles a month for free. Usually the limit's 3, and right now it's 100. So there's some discount research out there that's available. And also if you go interviewing people, a piece of advice is, and I struggled with my family with this in particular, again, they don't call what they do magic. They don't call what they do a spell or a ritual or a charm. So you have to kind of ask how do you questions like, well, how did you make sure you always had money in your pocket? Or what could you do to make sure that the house was safe from lightning? Instead of saying, well, do you know any weather magic? Because it's not, my mother and grandmother were convinced that what they did was not magic.
This is a really great time to be a myth hunter. The things that you can find online is, especially the obscure, the non-traditional, just really out there kind of information. I found a website called forgottenbooks.com, and it's a London-based collection. Have you guys seen this one? I see you nodding too. It's really fantastic and full of just the most obscure things, from just obscure Celtic mythology to Irish pioneers in Kentucky to Crowley style manuscripts. And it's all the original writings. And with some of these being so completely outdated, yes, they are horribly racist, misogynistic, and horrible people in a lot of ways. But you get into their minds and the way that they're seeing these things and thinking them in real time too. I found some really great obscure things to use for my actually hell-based current book that I'm working on. Things that I have never come across in any of the. It's not your average bullfinches. I'll say that.
And well, and a lot of it, yeah, family stories. You know, I have a series that I'm writing, and a lot of times the place will help me decide on how I'm going to write about it. And so like place names will make a big difference. The families in that place, you know, whatever, you know, their family history is way back, I can pull that in and say, okay. You know, I listen to like the Lore podcast. There's a lot of those podcasts. There's a ton of them. You know, I joined a whole bunch of Facebook groups. Like there's the Polidori organization that's like academic studies on vampirism, and you'd be amazed how much academic stuff there is on that. But, you know, and there are like professional, you know, academic events that you can go to. I went to the International Vampire Film and Arts Festival, and there are like a ton of academics who have presentations that they do that's specifically just on vampirism. And so in those academic papers, a lot of those have been published as, you know, as academic work. So, I mean, it's serious business. So yeah, there's a lot of it out there.
I'm going to throw out, as well as the Lore podcast, the Bedtime Stories podcast.
Yes.
Is super fun. Very, very scary at some points, but very fun.
So perfect for bedtime.
Yeah.
So this actually leads me to the question that I said I was going to ask last, but because we're talking about academia and some of those resources, some of the courses that I have seen offered often will deconstruct folklore and folk magic myths along lines of patterns such as gender, culture, all of these different ways to kind of dig down and look at those, you know, look at the large things in a small way, or in ways that people might not necessarily know. So as writers, when we're setting up the story and the world, how can we incorporate some of those themes, and what might be some of those themes that would make a good bedrock for the world building that we would do using folklore and folk magic?
Well, the series that's behind me here, I do it through story, quite specifically in the books, because it's a patriarchal society, and there are certain stories that have been passed on to control the population. But then there are the real versions of the stories that are behind those that break down the controlling factors in those stories. And as the characters learn more and more what the true stories are, they start to understand differences about the world and how culture is controlled through story, and how the stories themselves are a form of magic and can be used to change the world. And so there's a lot of that subtle kind of layering, but it's like the things you don't see. The what is the Shirley Jackson story with the canned goods, where she's murdered her husband, but nobody believes she's murdered her husband, but the women come in and they see that the canned goods have all been destroyed and her bird has been murdered. I can't remember the name of the story. But the women know that it's a murder, and the men think it's an accident because there's no way this little woman could have done this, because why would she? But the women understand on a cultural level, on a dynamic level, the subtleties of what's really happening, because they know the real story. They can read the real story in that space. And so understanding how different characters are going to see the same situation is part of that breakdown. And you can have one character seeing something one way and one character seeing something another way, and somewhere there you're going to get to the truth, but it's not going to be the same truth because they don't have the same information and they don't have the same background. So when you're drilling down through story, you need to keep in mind the perspective of your characters and what their background is and how they're going to see the things that they run into and what they're going to be aware of and how they're going to break that down, because it's going to be different for every character in your book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Shirley Jackson was very good for that.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to have to look up the name of that story now. It's going to drive me crazy.
I really like to look for my folklore and my folk magic that I use in my stories to answer three main questions for me. One, who are their cultural heroes? Who are their cultural villains? And what are they afraid of? What are they warding against? If they're tossing salt over their shoulder for luck, what are they afraid is going to happen? That's something that you can really lean on to incorporate into your story in just small gestures, small words that slowly kind of build up the picture of, are they afraid of plague? Are they afraid of something else that's happened in their history? What has had such an impact on their culture that this has become something completely ingrained that they do, often without thinking? Because a lot of our folklore, a lot of our cultural tendencies that we do, it's just, we grew up with it, we know it's a part of our lives, but it's very instinctual. And it tells you a lot about the people, their history, what has shaped them. As far as their heroes and their villains, it also tells you what they value as a culture. If their heroes are veterans or warriors, or are they doctors and kind-hearted, compassionate kings, what do they value most? I think there's a lot of things that you can answer with those questions.
Dee?
I'm a little out of my depths on this one because I don't do as much fiction writing, but I will say with some of the writing that I have done, I've spent a lot of time exploring, so it's similar to what Paige has said, but slightly different, insiders and outsiders concepts of magic. You know, so somebody who's, you know, kind of steeped in a tradition, has experienced that tradition, and it's just the way life is, will really perceive their practices as something completely different as someone coming in from the outside and observing it, you know, as from an almost folkloric or anthropological perspective, and looking at it and, you know, kind of identifying it. And that's where you get people who get into, in fiction as well as in real life, categorizing and going, oh, well, this aspect fits into this box and this aspect fits into that box. And the people with looking at their experiences from the inside, from their own tradition, don't tend to categorize. They don't need to, because it's just the way things work. So you can play off that in fiction between that analytical breakdown versus the just instinctive following of a particular path, which I find really interesting.
For me, I have characters that have lived, you know, like 400 years. So they'll have their experience that they've brought with them. And then I have like an ingenue character who has no idea what's going on or what the rules are, how any of this is supposed to work. And so that interplay is an interesting thing. But I like having the rules and then breaking them a little bit. So that even the people who have been in that world a long, long time are suddenly like, wait, what? That? that's what happens? I didn't know. And, so that's kind of a fun thing to play with. And, to me, bring in their personal history helps to flesh that out. And I have some characters who are from one culture and some from another. And so it allows me to kind of figure out, okay, how did there's a ton of different traditions of vampirism. And so each of them comes at it thinking this is how the rules work, and it isn't necessarily so. Or there's, some things that will kind of, make their expectations different. So, but that's it. It is fun for me to play with the reader's expectations too, so that they come into it and they're like, oh, of course the vampire is going to be like this, and that's not necessarily what happens.
So it actually makes me think of something, because we had talked about rules, and we had kind of talked a little bit about the things that you do, who you venerate, who you do not. And I started thinking about the concept of taboo, which a lot of folklore will, even if it doesn't necessarily address it right out, it definitely conveys this concept of what is allowed and what is not. So have any of you had a chance to incorporate any sort of taboo restrictions in your own world building, or have you seen this done well in other books that maybe draw on folklore or folk magic?
Yeah, I mean, I do it a little bit in mine, but it's more a cultural controlling factor than it is a factor of something that you don't want to do that because X will happen if you do. It's more about control. But a book that I think really does that well and plays with it well is Uprooted by Naomi Novak, where, things are just so, but nobody's really certain why, but bad things will happen if. So I think that's a wonderful example of taboo. And then getting to the beauty of that book is you actually get to the heart of the why that those things are taboo. Why some things are expected and why things are not allowed. You actually get the answers to those, which in a lot of books you don't. It's just, stories you don't. It's just something you don't do. So part of the reason I love that book is because she digs around in that a little bit, that very aspect.
I think my books are a lot like Paige's, where most of my cultural taboos are more regarding how society is controlling their women. For example, one of the young women in the third book in my series walks out onto the crowded area wearing pants. People can see her legs, and of course, it's just the most scandalous thing ever. But that's when it's more familiar to us. But I can't, yes, I can't do a taboo question on a world building panel without calling out Brandon Sanderson for his just amazing use of taboo and everything, like the Stormlight Archive, where the upper echelon especially have the safe hand, the left hand, cannot be seen. If you accidentally touch somebody with it that's not family or not close, and heaven forbid you wear a glove over it, because that's just sexy. Things like that have always, it pulls you into a story in just a really unexpected way. It is something completely alien and foreign, but it's exciting. It makes you buy it somehow, even though it's completely screwball. It's something that you attach to it somehow. I think it's a great use for a story.
Similar to Uprooted that Paige talked about, one of my favorite books is The Gate to Women's Country by Sherry Tepper. And that's another one where there's all these rules, there's all these regulations for about why society, or how society is run. And there's a complete separation of the genders, and, women only interact with men in these very formalized ways. And they go back to using Greek tragedy in order to illustrate the point to the younger women in the society. And the entirety of the book is getting to why is it that way, and what is it doing, what function is it performing in the society. And it was formative for me when I read it. It was eye-opening and shocking and just amazing the first time I read that book.
That book broke me. I love that book. Yeah.
And mine is like so very different from what you guys write, but there's a ton of folk stories, and I went to Romania with the International Vampire Film and Arts Festival, and they have a whole ton of expectations and taboos that have to do with vampires, and where do how do you deal with the dead, and if you think that your relative is coming back, what do you do? And do you all the thing with the brick in the mouth, and you stamp their body down with a stake and all that kind of thing. And and every single vampire story, every movie, comic book, whatever, they all have their own take on that. And it's really interesting to see the differences between like that Romanian style versus like the German style and American style. It's all very, very different, and each of them has their own expectations for how do you handle the dead? What are the rules for how these vampires do whatever they do to you? Is it that they're sucking your soul? Is it they're actually eating your flesh? Some of them, the revenants. So there's a whole different set of expectations, and all of it has its own thing. So so those taboos are all, it's very different based on where you are, and it's fun to play with those. There's so many different ones to play. They're just a huge number of them. So
I can bet it seems like every culture has a vampire of some kind in its tradition.
yeah, like I've seen some of the Asian vampire. Every one of them is totally unique. And so Rio, yours were a fantastic short piece that was just like horrific. That's a vampire story. So I mean, there are a ton, but yeah, everyone is different. Every one of them is different.
And vampires are such an interesting choice of characters anyway, and I don't write them, but I really enjoy them, which is kind of counterintuitive because they're scary. But my favorite vampire stories and speaking of folklore and history, are the Chelsea Quinn Yarborough books, which I think they're re-releasing all of them, and there's over like 40 of them, and I'm so excited because she basically does massive historical and cultural research, and then she just sets Saint-Germain, her vampire, in the middle of it and lets him observe culture. But he's 10,000 years old, and so you follow him from historical fiction to historical fiction, and you get his distant perspectives and his present perspectives, and oh my God, she's just the best. When people ask me for vampires, I just throw Chelsea Quinn Yarborough at them. Quinn is amazing. So, but folklore, magic, taboo, culture, all of those things she rolls in. And since he moves all around the world, you get to see those aspects that Delia was talking about. You get to see these different cultures. And because he's a vampire, he has to face what does and doesn't work in relation to him in all these different cultures throughout the world. And her books run all the way up through present day. So I just think those are fantastic if you want to explore that kind of thing and kind of experience that the way Delia does in her books as well. So it's pretty cool.
Well, I really loved having these vampires who are really old, and they're now in a modern society, and they can't figure out, like, how do I hide now that there's cameras everywhere?
Yeah.
Like, what do I do about video surveillance? Oh my God, they all know who I am.
Exactly.
That kind of thing. I like playing with that, where they, you know what the expectation is, but it's not necessarily how it's going to work in a modern world.
And wait, what is consent?
Right. Right.
Oh no.
One of my characters is the Marquis de Sade, and he's like, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do now.
So what does modern folk magic look like? If we're gonna deal with characters in the modern setting, what does modern folk magic look like?
I don't think it's drastically different than it's ever been. I just think it doesn't get called magic anymore, if it ever was.
Yes.
Because, we poo-poo magic because of science. But I think the things that you do, like Dee was talking about, are still the things that you do. You know, you still knock on wood, and you still throw salt over your shoulder, and you still, if you're me, say a prayer to the goddess asphaltus when you want to find a parking space. I mean, you know, she's never let me down, by the way. You just don't ask for a space in front of the building, because that's, you're pushing it. But you know,
You temper your expectations.
you temper your expectations. Exactly. She's busy. So I think it looks much the same as it ever has. We just don't call it by that anymore. And I think culturally, it's going to depend on what area of the world you're in, and what, like, even what area of the country you're in. I was raised in New England, and the traditions up there on how you do things on a day-to-day basis to, say, get through a really bad winter vary greatly from what you do where I live now in North Carolina. But nobody calls it magic. It's just the things you do to get through the day, and the things you plan for, and the things you set up, and the traditions that you hold, and the stories that you're told to make your life easier.
Magic has always been all about transforming will and intent into practical applications. And if you walk into any bookstore right now, you see shelves full of positive thinking books. And if that's not magic, I don't know what else is. Taking will, transforming it into something you see in your daily life. And I really liked Dee's point earlier that, you know, even growing up with it in, you know, less recent modern times, they didn't call it magic. It wasn't magic. It was, like you said, just what you did. So Dee, what would they call it now?
They still just call it what they do. So my mother can stand next to me in her kitchen with herbs and candles and pray and do things with the candles and the herbs, and we can put them in the candle holder and they're covered in olive oil and blah, 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 and we're doing it all. And then later on we'll have a discussion and I will say, Mom, I'm so happy you and I can do magic together. And she's like, I don't do magic. And she's like, I don't do magic like you do magic, because I'm also interested in ceremonial magic. I'm like, well, no, you're not like doing the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram or anything, but yeah, you're doing, oh, no, we're just praying. I'm like, well, you're praying with extra added things. That's not just, normal people don't pray like that, woman. But when it comes to modern folk magic, it has to address the needs of modern people. And a lot of the needs of modern people and people in previous times are exactly the same. It's you know, I want to find a partner, I want to be safe, I want to have money, I want to be successful, I want to be famous, you know, all of those things are still exactly the same. In a lot of cases, it's just the sources for the materials are different. So there might be a spell that used to require going to get water from 7 different wells. And now it's been adapted and you go to 7 different faucets or 7 different sinks, and you go to people's houses and ask if you can use, you know, get a cup of water from their faucet so that you can have that water from 7 sources, you know. And a lot of times it's going into a store, it's going into an esoteric shop or a botanica to get an herb rather than wandering out into the woods and finding it on your own. So those sources for the material is different, but the needs and the practices are really similar still.
I have, you know, my characters, you know, they have, most people think that vampirism is a magical thing, and some of my characters thought that that's what was going on with them, and so they behaved in accordance with that. And then I have a vampire who is a scientist who's like, no, you have rabies. You have this scientific reason why these things are happening to you. And they're like, what are you talking about? You know, so I, you know, there's that expectation that the cultures had, that they bring into the story. And I think to me, that's a really interesting thing to look at, you know, expectation versus reality, and to play with what is real in this society and why do they do what they do. And some of it is just that they've just done it so many times, they do it because they've always done it that way. Well, of course we always had baby blood. What are you talking about? Of course it tastes better. And then some others are like, no, ew. So it's that to me, those kind of play on the expectations that each one brings to the story. So.
I have a quick question to Delia and the other members of the panel, if that's all right. Bringing in a thread of science like that, you said one of your characters was a scientist. Do you find it a struggle sometimes to mesh the magic in the scientific worlds? Or do you, like, is it a good foil for the two to work off each other? Is it difficult? Does it make for difficulties within your plot? Like,
I think it's fantastic. I think it's because magic and science are indistinguishable depending on what culture you're in. You know, if you showed up in 1600 with a flashlight, well, you know, I mean, that's magic, right? And that, you know, can you explain the battery and currents and blah, 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 and copper wire and whatever, you know, but that's just witchcraft. You just put all these things together and you've cast a spell on this box, and then you push it and then there's light, you know, that's witchcraft. So I think, again, your culture is going to inform that. A series that does that really well, plays with that, are the Cold Fire trilogy by C.S. Friedman, which is an older series, but still some of my all-time favorite books, where you're on a culture that was founded from an Earth-based foundation, but the spaceship crash landed on the planet at the edge of the galaxy because they couldn't go any farther. It was the last planet and the ship hadn't found any place habitable. But the planet is responsive to the creatures that live on it. And so when a human has a nightmare, that nightmare manifests as a demon, or whatever they've dreamed of comes real and tries to kill you. And so the planet has forces, and they can't use science. They know that science exists. They have all the documentation, they have the paperwork, they have the gadgets, and they can't use any of it because every time they try to use something physical and scientific, the magic attacks it. The Fae attacks it. And so that's a wonderful example of those two things coming into conflict and meshing perfectly in the story. They're great books.
I actually have a lot of fun messing with that in my Young Adult Dreams of Chaos series, where it's kind of
Such a great title.
think like thanks. Think like Terry Pratchett Discworld level of technology. It's, you know, very rudimentary, sailing, a lot of horse and buggy, no electric lights, anything like that. So the mages in this world are people who are beginning to mix science and magic in different ways, but they kind of become the Dr. Frankensteins, even if they are completely wonderful and good. Once people figure out that, oh, they're using magic in these little toys, they kind of, you know, out come the pitchforks, the burning torches, all of that good stuff, of course. But it's a lot of fun getting into their heads, especially since I work with engineers all day long, and they sound like magicians most of the time anyway. It's been a lot of fun to use it more as a foil. Like you're asking, is it a foil or is it a marriage? But with this one, it's a lot of humor base in that series anyway, so I get to use it for pratfalls even.
Yeah, I have my scientist character will start talking about, you know, cellular degeneration and all this stuff, and this guy's, I seriously, if he keeps telling me any more about this, I do not want to hear about DNA one more time. So it's kind of, it's fun, especially when you're talking about a character. One of them is much older than the other, and you know, there's that clash. That's a lot of having them be a foil against each other. Yes, because that's a great word, because yes, that's exactly what they do.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite hobbies now is to come up with magic melding technical terms like scatcatters and fundibulum dispersals, things like that, to use for the mages to make them completely unintelligible for anybody else.
That's
Fantastic.
It's almost like just come up with a word generator and you've got it.
That's great.
So we've kind of covered a couple of different topics, and everything from like I think it was Dee was talking about weather magic. In general, this is weather magic, but in specifics, this is a ritual. Or in general, we have magic and science mixing, but in specifics, we have these and I'm not even going to try to repeat the names, manipulator, dipolator, you know, these little things. So you have atmospherics versus details. So I was going to ask you all, is there one that you tend to start with when you're doing your world building? Do you start up here with weather magic or the concept of tech and magic together? Or do you come up with that specific concept and then build it out from there?
I'm a terrible one to ask this question because I am the most pantsing pantser that you'll ever find putting pants on. I don't even know what I'm writing till I'm writing it. Everything for me is like I walk into a room and I open the door and I go, "What's in here?" You know. But I tend to I write on an intimate level, but I think everything has a larger theme. And I think for me, it starts with mood. It starts with theme. So I think the vibe of it, the overarching setting, like the first book, speaking of weather magic, is dragon weather. And I had to figure out, well, okay, what is that about? So I think for me, if I'm thinking about it, it starts with a bigger picture and then it slides quickly into minutia. So if that's helpful.
For me, everything starts with the history. Once I know kind of the background of my people and whether or not I use even a third of the history in the books as I'm writing them, if I know it, I can know what levers I need to pull as far as their cultural issues, whether it's folklore, folk magic. Most folklore tends to be loosely based in historical events anyway, at least as far as the mythology that comes to us, and fairy tales similar. So it's a lot easier for me to pull those stories together if I know, in my head at least, what really happened, to put them on this place where they are right now.
For me, everything is based in character. So I start with the character and who are they? How did they get this way? What's their background? And so once I've decided who they are, then I go back and I might do like 6 months worth of research of just looking up stuff and gathering that stuff. And I might have been working on something else as a different project, but I'm just gathering data, just pulling stuff in. And then, you know, eventually what I'll do is I'll have this whole idea and I'll make a big chart. I'm big into visual stuff. So I'll make a big chart on my giant whiteboard. And then, you know, what I'll do is I'll have it all written down. Here's exactly what it needs to be. And then I'll put that all away so I'm not looking at it. And then I start writing and I write about the character. Once I have decided it in my head, I don't look at it anymore. And I don't do research once I'm in that story writing mode. That's a totally different part of my brain. So I get it so that it's in the back of my head, but I don't spend all my time trying to, you know, deal with every minute little detail of it when I'm in that zone. And after the fact, I'll come back and fact check myself and be like, okay, is that really right? Did I get that right? Do I want to change that rule? You know, but I try to establish it in great detail up front, and then I just stop looking at it and just let it flow out of me.
When I write, it goes two different ways. When I write nonfiction, I usually start with a real general title, a real general concept, and then realize it's far too big to put in one book and narrow it down, and that's far too big, and then narrow it down further until we get to something manageable. But when it comes to fiction, I'm usually struck with an image or an idea or concept that seems really cool, like one particular spell, ritual, or event that's magical, and then I end up wanting to build a story around that. And then from that one thing that I really, really love, I try to build everything else off of it so that it all seems to smoothly go together and all come from the same source and kind of all fit into the world scheme. So it usually comes from one seed, event, or idea, and then kind of expands out from that idea.
Nice. And then I've got a question. And this comes actually from an article by Charlie Jane Anders. I have absolutely no idea if I'm pronouncing this poor person's name correctly. But they wrote a pretty nice article on world building that you can find on Tor.com. And one of the things that they point out in this very long article, which I recommend, is that world building shows how things could be different. We've done a lot of this is what it is and this is what we've done, et cetera, et cetera. How, when we are building our worlds, what aspects can we put in there specifically to do with folklore and folk magic that might show us how things could be different?
That's a really good question. I love Charlie Jane Anders' work. I'm reading All the Birds in the Sky right now. I just love it. That's a tough one. Whew. So I think of a lot of ways how genre fiction can make things different and how world building can make things different. But specifically relating to folklore, that's a little tougher. I think it would have to do with, again, expectation of outcome by the characters. That the characters, instead of expecting a certain action or a certain story told or a certain song sung or a certain ritual completed, to have an outcome that the reader might expect based on the society that we live in, that it comes to something different. Like instead of, these several things you think are going to affect the weather, but it changes the color of someone's bed sheets or something instead, that you set up an expectation and you change it. That it's the same type of thing where if the guards are marching the prisoner to the dungeon, do the guards have to be male? No. I mean, can the guards be, agendered or female or whatever? So can you take something that people have seen before as a spell that people do and have it do something else? And that starts to plant you in a different world where things aren't the same, where things have different expectations, where we can make things better than they are now, because we don't have to make things the same when we're building something new.
Now, I've got a friend who writes some really amazing alternate history, but it's more of just a short story. She hasn't published. She writes amazing stuff, but she doesn't really want to publish. She uses hers more of a platform for not moralizing, but she tells a lot of fables this way with an alternate history background where you made me think of this page when you were talking about you set up an expectation and then you divert it somehow. And she'll do that with a setting that's, your typical day, getting ready, going to the school bus, but the kids maybe don't get on a school bus. They go to the cultural retraining camps where they are taught how to do something very intrinsic to this alternate world. And without making it a soapbox platform, she tells very visceral, very relevant stories. And she'll write them in like a single night. She'll have an idea, and the next day she's got a 15,000 word story that you would think it's gone through rounds of editing. And like I said, she hasn't published. She's amazing, and I'm pushing her. But
I'm jealous
she's
as
also
hell.
only
Tell her to
24.
publish it.
She's also only 24, 24 years old, and she's a natural. But there's a lot that you can do with that kind of a subversion that it's more impactful than just saying this is how we do this every day. It's jarring, something that catches the reader off guard, and that helps paint a more striking image than any kind of chunk of expository information about the world. You don't want to get lost in the paint. You want to give them emotional reactions to your story, and that makes them remember.
I think that when it comes to folk magic, because it has the potential of touching every single aspect of a character's life in your story, that gives plenty of opportunities for there to be touch point or friction between other things in the character's life, just like in our world today. So, society as a whole, the church or a religious organization, and in science, as we mentioned earlier, and other aspects of the waking everyday world, that we definitely have, very set in stone's perceptions of how they are in our world, because it's been that way for a very long time. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there in world building to subvert some of those expectations. And, you know, maybe all of society expects that everybody is a folk magician and carries around the materials for all of these little everyday spells, and that's the only way to get things done. And suddenly, you know, you have a character that refuses to do it because they think it's old-fashioned, or they just can't do it. You know, so there's lots of different you know, ways that folk magic can be an arrow pointing at something that's accepted, because it's usually something that's disapproving of folk magic, and then you can toy with those expectations there.
Well, I mean, mine, it's a, you know, there's so many different aspects of vampirism that have a magical element. There's so many. And, you know, but I also really love like dark fantasy, like Holly Black's stories are great, because those fairy tales, and then she sets it in a modern world, and there's that really big contrast between the magical, you know, things that are happening, and then this concrete, like, you know, being in a city, and there's, you know, the subway system with iron rails, and the fairies can't stand it, you know, things like that. I think it's a fun thing to do, those kind of contrasts, and some people do that very, very well. And, you know, I think that makes for a much more interesting story if you can take those expectations, and some of it, you know, if you can like subvert the reader expectations, that's so much better as a story plot. And to have a character, a lot of them, you know, they'll have an ingenue character that then is like, what's happening? I don't understand these rules. And so that's much more interesting story. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I have really enjoyed this panel. I really enjoyed getting to sit in on the discussion, especially on this topic of folklore and folk magic. And my TBR list is now about, there's a good number of books on it that weren't there when we started. So I do want to say thank you very much. Round of applause. Yes, I just made that cheesy joke.
Thank you.
And for those watching, if you enjoyed this panel, please be sure to check out Multiverse's other programming. There will be a full schedule available on multiversecon.org. Check it out, lots of cool stuff. And don't forget to go and check out the charity donations at ko-fi.com/multiverse.con. And come and get on our Discord, because it's also super fun. multiversecon.org/Discord. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.